If you're a member of the government who's participated in the development of this bioweapon, you're going to be held accountable. If it's not done the conventional way, it's going to be done by the general population understanding what's going on. And the general population can make a movement on its own to hold these people accountable, and they're going to be held accountable one way or another.
Hey everybody, Alex Newman here with the New American, and we have been covering the COVID crisis and the vaccines like nobody else because that's what you guys are asking for, and because that's what we're not allowed to talk about. So we have a returning guest with us today. He's been very, very popular here, incredibly knowledgeable. He's got a law degree, he's got a PhD, and he is a medical doctor. Just an incredible breadth and width of knowledge here. And we want to talk today about the Novavax vaccine. If you rely on the fake media at all, you've probably heard that this is the best, most awesome, incredible innovation in vaccines ever known to man, and we should all line up and take 15. But Dr. Fleming has some different ideas. He's also got a presentation he's going to share with us. Dr. Fleming, thank you for being with us, and tell us what is wrong with the Novavax vaccine.
Well, to begin with, I think there's a lot of misinformation, even about the Novavax vaccine. The people that are promoting it are promoting it as being safer and better because it doesn't actually inject you with the mRNA or the DNA of this virus, and that's correct. But that's where that correct information really stops. And so, what I wanted to do was provide some information about what the different vaccines really are, so you can get an idea of what's happening and how Novavax compares to them, and then show you the importance of the spike protein that we all keep talking about and the real harm that's being caused by that, and then briefly show you the treatments that are available that you can actually download for free from the website from FlemingMethod.com, and then also make you aware of the fact that there are actually some specific treatments. And maybe before I get into that, everybody's been talking about the Delta variant and how
Mm.
dangerous, potentially dangerous that is. And it's important for people to realize that viruses only change if there's an advantage to them. The first advantage is to be able to infect people and to find a host, and that was already accomplished with this gain of function with this virus. The only other reason why they change is because it's a benefit to their survival, and that what we're seeing with the Delta variant and everything else is that when we look at the genetic code inside it, the virus is actually deleting the inserts that were put in there by mankind. All the HIV and the PRRA inserts, this virus is cleaning itself up and changing. And so it's trying to survive by going back to being normal. So when everybody's worried about the Delta variant and thinking that they have to run out to get vaccinated to deal with it, what you should really say is hooray for the virus. It's doing what viruses are supposed to, which is to go back to normal. Okay. So with that,
Fascinating.
if you don't mind, I'll just run through these slides, do the
Yeah, let's
presentation,
do
and
it.
then provide you an opportunity to ask any questions. So I began by calling this simply SARS-CoV-2 drug vaccines because SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus, where COVID-19 is the disease. And so on the first slide, what I want to point out is in this, what looks like a very complicated diagram, this is a cell of the body. And what we're looking at is three different things here. The first part is where I'm looking at the virus, and you can see that with this light blue here and here. And the arrow drawn over shows how this virus attaches to our cells through a couple of different receptors, including that ACE2 receptor, will come inside of our cells, and then the envelope surrounding the virus unwraps and lets that genetic material, that mRNA, get inside where it gets to our ribosomes, and our ribosomes are the area of our cells that take the genetic code and turn it into protein. That's called translation. And when that happens, you get initial products that are made. In this case, you see spike proteins, but it could be an entire virus. And inside your cells, there are enzymes called proteasomes, like Adolph's meat tenderizer, that will break that apart and present it initially to the surface of the cell by what's called this major histocompatibility 1 complex. And it does that in a few days to what's called the T cells. So if you've heard of T cells, this is the first part of the immune response. It takes 3 to 4 days, maybe 5 days. Some of that will be let out of the cell either as spike proteins if it's a vaccine or the entire virus if you're getting it from person to person. That will later be brought up in other cells, taken apart and exposed on the secondary cells through what's called major histocompatibility complex 2. And that's where the beta cells or the antibody making cells get exposed to it. So the first occurs at 3 to 5 days, the second at 7 to 10 days. That's the natural process for the virus. When we go over here to Pfizer and Moderna down here at the bottom, you'll see this arrow goes over here to a lipid nanoparticle. This is a cholesterol and fat molecule put together surrounding the mRNA. That will just simply fuse to the cell, and you see a whole lot of mRNA here. And that's because when the virus comes in, you maybe get hundreds or thousands. But when these lipid nanoparticles from Pfizer and Moderna come in, they carry 13.1 billion. They go through the same process of getting the ribosomes and making spike proteins and getting to the T cells and later to the B cells for antibodies, but they also go straight up into the nucleus. And we now know for a fact that some secondary studies have been done that came out in the last few weeks that show that this mRNA from the either the virus itself or from the vaccines gets incorporated into our human DNA in all but 3 sets of our chromosomes. So of 23 sets of chromosomes, we now have data that shows it gets into all but 3, and it will come out and go through the same process. The other approach that we've all gotten used to was the Janssen, which is Johnson and Johnson, or in other countries AstraZeneca, where they take double-stranded DNA, stick it inside an adenovirus, which can infect people. It comes in and it immediately, because its DNA has to go into the nucleus of our cells and begin that same process. So it looks complicated and there's a lot there, but by having it on a slide, your viewers can look at it, share it with people. Knowledge is important. Just seeing that there is a real scientific process that occurs is there. In these cases of both the Pfizer Moderna or the AstraZeneca or Janssen, genetic material is being injected into your cells, and as you've all heard, turns your cells into the manufacturing plant for making the spike protein. In the next slide, it looks a little complicated. Most of these slides look a little complicated, but that's the science behind it. What you're looking at here are the red lines and the blue lines. And the red lines show us what the genetic material or sequence is of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the blue lines show us the proteins that are made, in this case, the spike protein. And what I want to draw your attention to here is this little circle area, because I talked about the prion-like domain, or the part of the spike protein that has a prion to it. And prions cause diseases like mad cow disease and Alzheimer's. And this is the real danger of this spike protein. The virus is nothing more than the delivery system. The spike protein is the actual weapon that's causing harm. And this occurs slowly and methodically over time. And what you'll notice is that this W formation here is what clues us off to the fact that this is a prion-like domain. The reason for showing you that is a lot of people have been told that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are exactly what's in the virus. And once you take and look at the next slide, you will realize that they're not. This is the virus itself, and this is what the Moderna and this is what the Pfizer vaccine looks like. And all you need to do is compare these red lines, which is the genetics that they say are identical, and you compare it with this one with Moderna and this one with Pfizer, and you can see that the shape of these lines is not the same. What is the same is the prion region that they have gotten spot on to reproduce in the spike protein. So the vaccines do not, we now know they do not have the same thing that the virus is, except for the prion part of the spike protein. All right. The next slide shows, I just made that comment about we now know that SARS-CoV-2, whether it be from the virus or from the vaccines, reverse transcribes or gets into our human DNA. So transcription is DNA to RNA, and reverse transcription is RNA to DNA. We now know, here's the studies down here. You know me well enough by now to know that I'm going to give you the resource and the papers to go read if you're so inclined, or for your doctor or researchers, that this virus, whether it be the virus itself or the vaccines, inserts itself into all but three of our 23 sets of chromosomes. Chromosome 8, 15, and 20 still seem to be protected or not transcribed, but we now know that giving this to people will get it into our human DNA. So all those questions about does it or doesn't it, it does. Here's the slide you were kind of looking for to begin with. This is Novavax. This is the third type. And when they say they're not injecting that genetic code into humans, they're correct. What are they injecting it into? Well, they're taking a different virus called baculovirus, which can't infect people. It infects insects and arthropods. So somebody came up with an idea to take a virus that can't infect people, put the DNA of the virus into it, inject it into the cells of these moths, this moth, in fact, where it gets into the DNA of the moth, and then the moth cells make the spike proteins. Those spike proteins come out, they attach it to nanoparticles. So now they're no longer pretending there's no longer any nanoparticles because there have to be. They take a tree that has a soap that irritates the blazes out of people to cause an immune response, put that together with it, and inject it into people. So does Novavax inject the genetic code into you? No, it injects it into moth cells. So a moth can make partial proteins that get stuck together along with soap from a tree to inject inside of you. And at no point in time in my 53 years of research did I wake up from a nightmare thinking this would be a good idea, which tells me they've been doing this for some time with something else because they just didn't wake up one day to think about that. Why do I emphasize this spike protein in these prion-like domains so much? Well, two reasons. There are two major prions. One is that prion-like domain at the very top, which is the result of all of the things that humans have put into it for gain of function, the PRRA, the HIV components. But the other one is the HIV glycoprotein 120 that Shi Zhengli first talked about in the early 2000s. HIV glycoprotein itself is a prion, and the research was already published at the time, so Shi Zhengli knew about this. What is a prion disease? This is a picture of a brain, and you can see that most of it looks fairly good. It's pink, but in here you see all these white areas, and when we enlarge that, it looks like a sponge. So doctors, researchers call this spongiform encephalopathy, or a brain that looks like a sponge. What does that translate in general terms? That's mad cow disease. This is the result of a prion infecting a human brain, and it causes heart disease and the inflammothrombotic response that I've been talking about. So anything that puts this spike protein into your body is going to potentially produce this disease. And when they did, and this was in mice, and 95% of the mice died in 2 weeks, producing this mad cow disease. In the rhesus macaques, which are the monkey models that are close to humans, these are the areas of the brain that were damaged, and these were the slides under a microscope showing inflammatory cells. All this stained material are inflammatory cells. This area here is what's called a Lewy body, and that Lewy body formation is what causes Alzheimer's disease. The next slide shows the ultimate bioweapon being prion. So this is our 8th slide, prion disease. And you're going to see over here in the corner, you're going to see a lot of red stained area. These are prions that are moving from one neuron to another neuron. And then the other images to the right of that show this sponge brain or mad cow disease and how brains shrink. And in the next slide, we're going to see the actual bioweapon comparison itself, where this glycoprotein 120 attaches to what's called a sialic raft receptor, which was the work that I was doing in the early 90s that got everybody in the government stressed, because this is what's necessary for them to target the cells using this virus. And so the virus is the missile, and the warhead is actually the prion disease. In the next series of slides, the first one, there is information about treatments that are available for people if they get infected as outpatients. You get infected from somebody, you have runny nose, aches and pains, that type of thing. There's 4 different treatments that we laid out here that run the cost anywhere between $40 and $95. The doses are there for you to share with your doctors. In the next slide, the same thing is done for inpatients, which is a little small, but you can take and stop the frame and enlarge it or go to the website and download it so you can see it and you can see the transition between outpatient to inpatient treatments. And then finally, the next slide shows what types of treatments are available for people who've been vaccinated, who are having symptoms or who are getting shedding symptoms from other individuals. And again, it lays out exactly what the sequence is. We're doing this at sites in Europe. I just got asked by another site in the UK this morning for them to participate in this for the treatment of people there. So those are available for you to share with your doctors. In the next slide is something that should be extremely important for everybody because the research now shows that the simple drug called heparin that you can stick under your skin twice a day actually blocks the spike protein from attaching itself to our cells. So good old fashioned simple, I'm sorry, it's cheap heparin turns out to be a treatment for this virus and for anybody who's had vaccines or shedding problems. The next slide then shows the fact two important pieces of information. First off, if you've had the infection SARS-CoV-2 and you're wondering whether you have immunity to this virus, you do. The paper that was just published by Nielsen in this slide shows that people have antibodies, both IgG and IgA, to the entire spike protein, that regional binding area, the N-terminal domain, and the nuclear capsid of the virus, and that independent upon how severe that infection was, you've got immunity to it. You don't need to be able to measure antibodies in your bloodstream because you don't make antibodies to everything that you've been exposed to. You make memory cells. And that's important because the next slide over here shows, or in this slide rather on the right side, shows that if you've been exposed to influenza or cytomegalovirus, which means a big virus which causes a number of diseases, you already have T cell immunity to SARS-CoV-2, and you don't need to be vaccinated. And the last two slides are simply examples of books that I've already published. Plus, the last slide is merely the book that's coming out on the 7th of September called "Is COVID-19 a Bioweapon?" So that's a lot of material, but your viewers can kind of look through that at their leisure and kind of wrap their brain around it to better understand the fact that you are not going to be perhaps injecting the genetic sequence of the virus into yourself with Novavax, but what you're injecting is the spike protein, which is actually the harmful part of it, that was simply made inside the cells of moss that you're now injecting into yourself with an irritant from trees.
Pretty amazing stuff, Richard. And so, where do we go from here now? I mean, obviously, people want to be weary of this. People need to do their research. But where is the world heading? I mean, on one hand, we're hearing that we're maybe coming out of this COVID craziness, and the vaccines are responsible for allowing our economy to survive and for us to get some of our freedoms back. Then, on the other hand, you started off talking about the Delta variant. We see this new wave of fear mongering. We see more talk about lockdowns, not just in the United States but overseas. Do you think this is going to go on in perpetuity, and they're just going to come up with new vaccines and keep threatening us?
Yeah, I think that the only way that this stops is when we hold these people legally accountable in court. And I'm working with people over in Europe right now with the International Criminal Court, bringing cases forward. Some of those cases have been dismissed, but other cases with the gain of function research information that I've provided are going forward. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold these people criminally accountable, just like they did in Nuremberg. Because if you want to ask yourself what you would have done in the 1930s and 1940s, when Adolf Hitler was in power and Joseph Mengele was running research on people in concentration camps, all you need to do is look around yourself today and you'll have the answer to what would you have done. and you're going to find yourself in one of two groups, either those that go along with it, like much of the medical group did in Nazi Germany, and I'm calling for the physicians to be held accountable too, or you're going to resist and you're going to say enough is enough, and you're going to do the right thing and demand that these people be held accountable.
So is this process underway? Do you think it's plausible that we will be able to hold some of these people accountable?
Oh, I intend. I've told people that as long as I'm living and breathing, I'm going to be pursuing this to take and hold these people accountable. These are criminals, and physicians who are providing these vaccines to people are not providing informed consent. And the reason why I know they're not providing informed consent is because on the 5th of June we opened up the package inserts for people to see on Event 2021, and they are intentionally blank. So if you're a physician and you open those up, you saw they were intentionally blank. You had no information to provide informed consent to your patient. You're morally and legally obligated to provide informed consent. If you've read the emergency use authorizations, and we've gone through these documents before, you'll see that statistically there's no fewer people who get COVID or die if they get vaccinated or if they don't get vaccinated. There's no difference in the outcome. So, as a physician, if you're telling people to take these vaccines and you haven't read those documents, then you've violated your obligations to the patient. You've violated all these oaths: the Nuremberg Code, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the AMA Code of Ethics, the Helsinki rules for treatment of patients. If you've read them and you've told them to take vaccinations, then you violated your Hippocratic or your Geneva oath as a physician, because you're supposed to be taking and putting the patient first, not the government. If you're a member of the government who's participated in the development of this bioweapon, you're going to be held accountable. If it's not done the conventional way, it's going to be done by the general population understanding what's going on. And the general population can make a movement on its own to hold these people accountable, and they're going to be held accountable one way or another.
What about the people who've been silencing everybody? I mean, for a year almost, we were proposing the idea, and it seemed like there was a lot of evidence to support it that this virus, whatever, had actually come out of a laboratory, and
Yep.
and it wasn't just us, but we were censored, we were silenced, we were demonetized, we were deplatformed. You had Google downranking us, you had Facebook putting fake fact checks and banning. Is there some level of accountability there? I mean, we had our governor here in the state of Florida, for example, brought some of the leading scientists in the world from Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, to talk about some of the problems with the policy responses, the face masks, the lockdowns, and all the rest of it. And one of them, Dr. Scott Atlas, who was the head of Trump's coronavirus task force, actually said, "Look, this censorship that they're doing is also very dangerous." What do you think? Is there some level of responsibility there for trying to impede the scientific and medical discussion where people could have discovered these things?
Oh, there absolutely is. I think you have to ask the question, why are the people doing this interference? Why are the same people that were involved in the development of this weapon the same people that are involved with preventing doctors from providing treatment, that's all treatments that are already FDA approved for something else, that doctors have always been able to treat, use medications for other purposes for what they were FDA approved? These are the same people that developed the vaccines. You have to ask where the money's coming from. And when you look at that very seriously, you'll see that the Gates Foundation, the Helmsley Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, the NIH, NIAID, Department of Defense, they're all funding these same projects. And one of the things right now, in addition to making people aware of this and making them ask questions and demanding that these people be held accountable, is also holding accountability for the doctors, holding accountability for mainstream media. That you're supposed to be a journalist. Your obligation is to tell the truth, not to take a political stance. I don't care what your political party is. I don't discuss my political affiliations with anybody. It's a violation of my Hippocratic oath to take that into consideration with anything. And finally, I think people need to start responding with their pocketbook. So if you're a student and you're going to a university, right now, my understanding is the state of Iowa. the state of Texas, and I believe the state of Florida, and probably a dozen other states are not, their colleges are not requiring students to be vaccinated or masked when they return. If you're going to a state university where those universities are getting money from these same players that have been involved in this disaster, those aren't the only universities in the country to go to. Switch universities, go to a state where they're not taking and forcing their students to be part of an experiment or to be masked up. That will send a direct message to these people.
Yeah, and you hit on something very interesting there too. We've got the major pharmaceutical companies, major stakes owned in those pharmaceutical companies by companies like BlackRock and State Street, these huge international conglomerates that stay behind the scenes. And at the same time, they own a stake in the major media companies that are acting as kind of marketing arms for these new experimental medicines that are being put out there with no disclosure of any of this. It really is at least it seems to be very unethical. I know we've only got a few minutes left here, Dr. Fleming, but I had a couple more things I want to ask you about. The numbers, right? We keep hearing all the fake media is just throwing out all these numbers. 99% of the people who died recently from COVID were unvaccinated, so we're all supposed to be very scared. As I understand it, there is some serious manipulation going on from the CDC when it comes to the VAERS reporting system after Tucker Carlson revealed that huge numbers of people were turning up dead after the vaccine. They started manipulating those numbers. They also, as I understand it, are manipulating the number of cycles used in the PCR test with vaccinated people to try to keep the number of COVID cases down among the vaccinated. Is this real? And if so, does this provide any kind of evidence or suggest that there's some kind of complicity going on in these government agencies with this?
Well, to begin, the PCR test is a very good test, but it's never been used the way that Kerry Mullis, the man who designed it, said. In his patent, he was very clear you stop at 20 cycles. Beyond that, it's not doing what the test is supposed to do. Kerry Mullis was the last person before me who took on Anthony Fauci and said, I will debate you anywhere, anytime, the real science. And that's what I've said to Fauci several different times. And I know he's listening because he's responded using terms like SARS-CoV-1, which I've used, that he responded when he was dealing with Senator Rand Paul. Let's address a very important piece of information on VAERS. If you are a physician and you call into the VAERS number that's available to us to call into, you will get a recording. It will send you to another telephone number that when you call in, you will get a recording. How do I know that? Because I tested it again yesterday. The other thing
Wow.
is that how do you know whether somebody has an adverse event to a vaccine? There's something called ICD 10 codes, which identify the disease state that you have to put down as a physician when a patient is seen to be paid for by insurance, including the federal government. Guess what? There's an ICD 10 code for you got a reaction to the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. You've got a code. There's one for influenza vaccines, adverse effect. You know what there is for SARS CoV 2? SARS CoV 2 has no ICD 10 code for an adverse vaccine reaction. So you can't enter it into the computer system to be monitored to show that people have it. You will get codes that pop up that says the patient refused the vaccine. There's one that says the patient was non-compliant. If you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm looking at my sheet. And there's three others that says that the patient had no access to the vaccine. But there is not a code for patient came in, had the vaccine, and had an adverse event. So do you think anything's going to be recorded on the computer system? Absolutely not. And I've spoken with a number of colleagues who have tried to submit to the VAERS system. Computer wise, it gets kicked out. I've listened to patients tell me they've talked to their doctors, and their doctors say, oh, that's not an adverse event to the vaccine. You're just imagining it. So these numbers, for a variety of reasons, are not being kept honest. And yet, despite all of that control, there's over 6,000 deaths already reported, right?
Yeah.
That with all these types of efforts, right?
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Dr. Fleming, I just have one more question for you. We have Biden now saying, and his press secretary, Jen Psaki, saying that they're going to be sending people door to door to promote these vaccines. You're a lawyer. What responsibility do we have? Do we have to answer the door? What do we do when some government person comes to propose that they want to inject our families with vaccines? What can we do?
To begin with, unless somebody has a warrant to enter your house, a court ordered warrant to enter your house, they don't have the legal authority to enter your house. They don't this is not an approved drug. There is no drug that is required for an American citizen to take it. For them to come into your home they need a warrant to come into your home. And I'm pretty certain that Mr. Biden, President Biden, has not provided these people with a warrant to come into your home. So the very best thing you can do is to tell them you're not interested. It's your home, to leave your premise.
Excellent.
Don't let them in. Don't, well, can we come in? No, don't let them in. They don't belong in your home.
Very good. Dr. Fleming, where can people find more about your work? Give us your website one more time.
Fleming Method, FLEMING Flemingmethod.com.
Excellent. Dr. Fleming, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for that incredible information about the Novavax vaccine and your insight on all these other topics. We sure appreciate it. Folks, as Dr. Richard Fleming, again, he's got so many degrees and expertise. It's just an incredible guest. I hope you'll take this information and share it. If they say, oh, maybe the other vaccines, maybe that you should be skeptical of those, but here's a new one. You need to send this information to your friends, to your family, to your neighbors. YouTube and all the rest of the big tech companies are not going to allow this to be distributed. So we really depend on you guys to get the message out. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, not in the way that the government means, and God bless you all.